Please turn off all cell phones or anything else that would disturb the performance. No photography. Women Lore brings you live women in history who have made historical contributions. The scripts are adapted directly from women's own writings. Today, Betsey Means will be here, and she is the artistic director of Women Lore, and she will be performing Jane Addams. Jane Addams, from 1860 to 1935, was a crusader for social justice, a dedicated American who devoted her life to caring for the underprivileged and oppressed, and to fighting for the rights of workers, women, and children. In 1888, on one of her many trips to Europe, she observed the social experimentations at Toynbee Hall in London. This led to her decision to establish a similar center in Chicago, where she could put her principles into action. Chicago's Hull House would later become known as one of the most famous settlement houses in America. Addams is considered by many a pioneer in the field of modern social work. In 1931, she was the co-winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. Imagine the year is 1910. You have come to the poor industrial west side of Chicago to volunteer at Hull House. You have a meeting scheduled with Jane Addams, the mother of the settlement movement in the United States. You will have a tour of the Hull House settlement, visit the Labor Museum, and enjoy tea with Miss Addams. Let us give a warm welcome to Miss Jane Addams.
I am so sorry that I am late. Mary told me that you were coming. I have just come from the women garment workers that ran late. They're on strike. There was a cut in the piecemeal rate in September. Shot number 5 triggered a walkout. The end sight for their working conditions. I apologize that I am late. Oh, what lovely flowers. Oh, Mary must have arranged them. How lovely. Miss Smith is so good to me. I would find life a different thing without her. So, welcome to Hull House. It will hopefully give you the warm welcome of an inn. A warm welcome to you all. What has brought you here? I believe Mary told me that you would like a tour of the settlement, a visit to the Labor Museum, a meeting with the grandmother of American settlements. How do you do? And yes, you are in the presence of Saint Jane. I positively feel my callers peering into my face to detect spirituality. Nothing is more certain but the improvement in human affairs is wholly the work of uncontented characters. I am an uncontented character. I was and am haunted by an ideal life. What, after all, has maintained the human race on this old globe, despite all the calamities of nature and tragic failings of mankind, if not faith and new possibilities, courage to advocate them? The settlement house, Hull House, is an effort to express that democratic ideal. It's an experiment, an experimental effort to aid in the solution of the industrial and social problems that are engendered by the modern conditions of life in a great city. Our goal is the building up a culture of social democracy. Would you care for a cookie? Democracy. Is it not Abraham Lincoln who cleared the title in our democracy? He made plain once and for all The democratic government, associated as it is with all the mistakes and failings of the common people, still remains the most valuable contribution America has made to the moral life of the world. Our settlement movement, Hull House, is an effort to express that democratic ideal, that the blessings which we associate with a life of cultivation and refinement can be made universal and must be made universal if they are to be made permanent. That the good we secure for ourselves is precarious and uncertain, floating in midair, if it is not secured for all of us and incorporated into our common life. In the autumn of 1889, without any previous social theory or economic views, I came to make my home in this industrial district of Chicago. Perhaps a simple statement of an earlier effort might be of value. So, welcome to my home, our home, your home, the social experiment that is Hull House. There is a theory that our genuine impulses may be connected to our childhood experiences. And since some of you, Mary told me, have inquired, how did an educated, wealthy woman become interested in living among the poor? I will share with you some of my early history. What incidents and experiences should be selected for recital? Well, I was a delicate child with the further disability of a curved spine. I was ugly, pigeon-toed, and my crooked back obliged me to walk with my head very much on one side. My father, Jane Addams, was so distinctly the most dominant figure in my life. My mother died when I was a baby, and my father's second marriage did not occur until my 8th year. It was my supreme affection for my father that drew me into the moral concerns of life. My father was an Illinois state senator between the years 1854 and 1870. And even as a child, I was dimly conscious of the grave march of human affairs and its comings and goings to the state capital. Children raised in the 1860s and 1870s in the simplicity which is given to the understanding of a child, caught a notion of imperishable heroism when they were told that brave men gave their lives that the slaves might be free. Although I was but 4 years old when Lincoln died, I distinctly remember the day on which I found on our 2 white gateposts American flags companioned with black. I tumbled down on the harsh gravel walk in my eager rush into the house to inquire what they were there for. To my amazement, I found my father in tears, something I had never seen before, having assumed, as all children do, that grown-up people never cry. The American flags, my father's tears, and the impressive statement that the greatest man in the world had died, constituted my baptism, as it were, into the thrilling and solemn interests of the world, lying well outside our 2 white gateposts. I always associate Lincoln with the tenderest thoughts of my father. I recall an incident that happened when I was 7 years old. for the mill in which my father transacted his business that day was closed in 1867. The mill stood in a neighboring town adjacent to its poorest quarter. Before then, I had always seen Cedarville, Illinois, the little city of 10,000, with all the admiring eyes of a country child. It had never occurred to me that all of its streets were not as bewilderingly attractive as those that contained the glittering toy shop or confectioner. On that day, I had my first sight of poverty, which implies squalor, and felt the curious distinction between the ruddy poverty of the country and that which even a small city presents in its shabbiest streets. I remember launching at my father the pertinent inquiry, why people live in such horrid little houses so close together. And after receiving the explanation, I declared with much firmness that when I grew up, I should, of course, have a large house, but it would not be built among the other large houses, but right in the midst of horrid little houses like these. I had that curious sense of responsibility regarding the world's affairs that little children often exhibit. As my 3 older sisters had already attended the seminary at Rockford, of which my father was trustee, without any question I entered there at 17. I had been very ambitious to go to Smith College, but I well knew my father's opinion in regard to the education of his daughters, implied a school as near his home as possible, followed by travel abroad. In lieu of the wider advantage that an Eastern college is supposed to afford, it was with great disappointment that I entered humdrum Rockford. After the first few weeks of homesickness were over, I became very much absorbed in the little world that the boarding school in any form always offers to its students. We worked in those early years as though we truly believed the portentous statement of Aristotle. There's the same difference between the learned and the unlearned as there is between the living and the dead. We were very fond of quoting Carlyle. 'Tis not to taste sweet things, but to do noble and true things, that the poorest son of Adam dimly longs. Towards the end of our 4 years' course, we students debated much as to what we were going to be. And long before the end of my school days was over, it had become quite settled in my mind that I should study medicine and live with the poor. That next winter, I went to Philadelphia to the Women's Medical Center, but the spinal difficulty, which had plagued me since I was a child, forced me into Dr. Weir Mitchell's hospital in the late spring. In the following winter, I was literally bound to a bed in my sister's house for 6 months. The long illness left me with a sense of nervous exhaustion. There was much nervous depression at the foundation of my spiritual struggles, remaining long after Hull House opened. After I graduated, my father often also suddenly passed away, and I was informed by a physician that I should give up clinics and dissecting rooms and spend the next 2 years in Europe. A poignant experience occurred during the first few months after I arrived in London. It was on a Saturday night that I received a radical impression of the wretchedness of East London, and saw for the first time the overcrowded quarters of a great city at midnight. A city missionary had taken a party of tourists to the East End of London to witness the Saturday night sale of decaying vegetables and fruits, which owing to the Sunday law in London could not be sold until Monday, and as they were beyond safekeeping, were disposed of as late as possible on Saturday night. On Mile End Road, from the top of an omnibus, pausing at the end of a dingy street, we saw two huge masses of ill-clad people clamoring around two hucksters' carts. They were bidding their farthings and halfpences for a vegetable held up by the auctioneer, which he at last scornfully flung with a jibe at its cheapness to the successful bidder. In a momentary pause, one man broke away from the group, and on having bid on a cabbage, he had caught it and sat down instantly on the curb and devoured it, unwashed and uncooked as it was. They were huddled together in ill-fitting cast-off clothing, the ragged finery you only see in East London. Their pale faces were dominated by that most unlovely of human expressions, the cunning and avarice of the bargain hunter who starves if he cannot make a successful trade. And yet the final impression was not of the tawdry, ragged clothing or the pinched and sallow faces, but of myriads of hands, work-worn, pale, clutching forward for food, already unfit to eat. Perhaps nothing is so fraught with significance as the human hand, this oldest tool with which man has clawed his way into the current in which he is constantly grasping forward. In the midst of the distress over the poverty which was suddenly driven into my consciousness, there was mingled a sense of futility, of misdirected energy, of the belief that the pursuit of cultivation would not in the end bring either solace or relief. The assumption that the educated, sheltered girl has nothing to do with the bitter poverty and social maladjustment that is all about her, and which, after all, cannot be contained, for it breaks through in poetry and literature and a burning tide that overwhelms her. It peers at her in the form of a heavy-laden market woman or underpaid street laborer chiding at her with a sense of uselessness. On my second trip to London, 6 years later, 1888, I found myself back in the East End at a social settlement called Toynbee Hall. It was founded in 1884. Toynbee Hall is a social settlement founded and created by a Church of England vicar, Samuel Barnett, and his wife Henrietta, in response to the growing realization that enduring social change was not going to be achieved through the existing individualistic and piecemeal approaches. The radical vision was to create a place for future leaders, young men from Oxford and Cambridge, bring them into the East End, having them volunteer and work, bringing them face to face with poverty, and giving them an opportunity to come up with practical solutions that they could take with them into national life. It's hard to say just when the very simple plan that afterward became the settlement began to form itself in my mind. It may have been even before my second trip to Europe. But I gradually began to think that it would be a good thing to rent a house in the city of Chicago, where many primitive and actual needs are found, where young women who had been given over exclusively to study could restore a balance of activity along traditional lines and learn of life from life itself, where they could try out some of the things they had been taught and put truth to the ultimate test that it dictates or inspires. The mere foothold of a house, easily accessible, ample in space, hospitable and tolerant in spirit, in the midst of the large foreign colonies which so easily isolate themselves in American cities, would be in itself a serviceable thing for Chicago. In January 1889, I found myself and my dear friend, Miss Ellen Gatestar in Chicago, searching for a neighborhood wherein we might put our plans into execution. It was in the early spring, in March. On a Sunday afternoon, we passed a fine old house, standing well back from the street, surrounded on three sides by a broad piazza supported by wooden columns of an exceptionally floral, wooden Corinthian design and proportion. The house had been built in 1856 for one of Chicago's pioneering citizens, Mr. Charles J. Hull, and although battered by its vicissitudes, was still essentially sound. The current owner, Miss Helen Culver, a niece of Mr. Charles J. Hull, the following spring gave us a free leasehold on the entire house. Her kindness has continued through the years, until the group of 13 buildings which at present comprises our equipment was built largely upon land that Miss Culver has put at the use of the settlement. On the 18th of September, 1889, the star and I settled into our new home. The fine old house responded kindly to repairs. Its wide hall and open fireplace always offering a gracious aspect. We furnished the house as we would have furnished it were we in another part of the city, with the photographs and impediments we collected in Europe and a few pieces of family mahogany. Perhaps those first days laid the simple foundations which are certainly essential for continual living among the poor. First, genuine preference for residence in an industrial district to any other part of the city because it's interesting and makes the human appeal. And second, the conviction, in the words of Samuel Barnett, Church of England vicar, founder of Toynbee Hall, that the things that make men alike are finer and better than the things that keep them apart. And that these basic likenesses, if they are properly accentuated, easily transcend the less essential differences of language, race, creed, and tradition. It was here at Hull House that I was launched into the stormy intercourse of life. Hull House, 800 South Halsted Street. Halsted Street is one of the great thoroughfares of Chicago, 32 miles long. The stockyards are to the south. These shipbuilding yards are in the north branch of the Chicago River. Hull House once stood in the suburbs, but the city has steadily grown up around it, so now its site has foreign colonies on 3 or 4 sides. Between the Hull House and the Chicago live about 10,000 Italians. To the south on 12th Street are the Germans. The side streets are given over almost entirely to the Russian and Polish Jews. Still further south, merging into the Jewish colonies, is a huge Bohemian colony, so vast that Chicago ranks as the 3rd largest Bohemian city in the world. To the northwest are the French-Canadian, clannish in spite of their long residence in Chicago. To the north were the Irish first-generation Americans. Still further north and directly west were the long-standing citizens of Chicago, many of whom owned their own homes and had lived in the city for years. The policy of the authorities of the 19th ward of never taking an initiative and always having to be urged to do their duties is obviously fatal in a neighborhood where there's little or no understanding of civic engagement. The idea underlying our self-government breaks down in such a war. The streets are inexpressibly filthy. Number of schools inadequate. Street lighting bad. Pavement miserable, altogether lacking on the alleys and side streets. And the stables are foul beyond description. Hundreds of houses are unconnected to the street sewer. The older and richer inhabitants seem anxious to move away as rapidly as they can afford to. This makes room for the newly arrived immigrant, densely ignorant of civic duties. The houses of the wall, for the most part wooden, used to be occupied and were built for one family, now occupied by several. Rear tenements flourish. There often is no indoor plumbing save the faucet in the backyard. All of these foreign colonies we considered to be our neighbors. Our neighbors seemed to understand that we were here to perform the humblest neighborhood services. We were asked to wash the newborn babies, to prepare the dead for burial, to nurse the sick, and to mind the children. We early learned to know the children of hard-driven mothers who went out to work all day, often leaving the little things in the casual care of a neighbor, but often locked into the tenement rooms. When the hot weather came, the little things could not brook the stuffy confinement of the apartments, and as they couldn't leave the door open because of sneak thieves, many of these children were locked out. During our first summer, an increasing number of these poor little mites would wander into the cool hallway at Hull House. We kept them there. We fed them at noon, in return for which we were sometimes offered a hot penny held in a tight little fist, ever since the mother left this morning to buy something to eat with. Volunteers to the new enterprise came quickly. A charming young woman from the north side, Jenny Dow, organized our first kindergarten class. Miss Starr started a little reading party in our little upstairs dining room with a group of Italian women. The residents were very much like a large family. I quickly decided that excluding men from our staff was a mistake, so in 1890, George Hooker became our first male resident, and he was assigned to investigate garbage collection, which led me to becoming the garbage inspector a few years later. We women regularly called each other sisters. I was often called J.A. By 1900, Hull House had grown to 13 buildings with about 40 residents. A quarter of them were men. Among our residents, there were physicians, attorneys, journalists, businessmen, scientists, musicians, artists. I would love to read you a charming memory that one of our early residents, Mrs. Florence Kelly, left us. She's one of the foremost leaders in our fight for legislation for child and adult laborers. Here's Mrs. Florence Kelly's memory. On a snowy morning between Christmas 1891 and New Year's 1892, I arrived at Hull House, Chicago, a little before breakfast time, and found there Henry standing there, a Kickapoo Indian, waiting for the unlocked, always unlocked, front door to be opened. It was Miss Addams who opened it, holding on her left arm a pudgy baby belonging to the cook who was preparing breakfast. Miss Addams was hindered in her movements by a super energetic kindergarten child left by her mother while she went to a sweatshop to work. We were welcomed as though we had been invited. We stayed. Henry standing there, a handyman, for several months, and I as a resident, 7 happy, active years. The dozens of children who from the first came to Hull House were organized into groups, which were not quite classes and not quite clubs. The value of these groups consisted almost entirely in arousing a higher imagination, giving the children the opportunity which they could not have had in the crowded classrooms for initiative and for independent social life. In spite of these flourishing clubs for children, we were very insistent that settlement should not be primarily for the children, and that it was absurd to suppose that grown people would not respond to opportunities for education and social life. Education is the holy communion with generations living and dead. The settlement casts away none of those things that cultivated people have come to consider reasonable and goodly. But it insists that those belong as well to that great body of people who, because of underpaid, toilsome labor, cannot procure for themselves. Our charter was to provide a center for a higher civic and social life, to institute and maintain educational and philanthropic enterprises, and to investigate and improve the conditions of the industrial districts of Chicago. The educational aspects of a settlement, as well as its philanthropic, civic, and social undertakings, are but various efforts to help manifest social democracy. In spite of poignant experiences, or perhaps because of them, those first years of Hull House were more or less blurred with fatigue. But we could, of course, become accustomed only gradually to the endless activity. The children who came in the morning for the kindergarten classes were followed by the afternoon clubs of older children, and these in turn made way for the educational and social organization of adults, occupying every room in the house every evening. By the end of 2 years, 2,000 people a week were coming to Hull House. Life pressed hard in many directions. They were often bitterly pressed for money and worried about the prospect of unpaid bills. And we gave up one golden scheme after another because we could not afford it. We cooked the meals, we kept the books, we washed the windows without any thought of hardship. We thereby secured money for the consummation of some ardently desired undertaking. Despite our financial stringency, I always believed that the money would be given when we had once clearly defined and manifested some of our dreams and ideas. And that is indeed what happened. Living among the poor, constantly impressed by the kindness of the poor to each other. Our woman living upstairs will readily share her breakfast with the family below because she knows they are hard up. A man who had boarded with a family last winter will give a month's rent because he knows that the father of the family is out of work. Of all the social miseries, the most heartbreaking is unemployment. And it was inevitable that we should see much of it in a neighborhood where low rents attracted the poorly paid worker or newly arrived immigrant. We spent many hours in efforts to secure support for abandoned women, insurance for bewildered widows, damages for injured operators, furniture from the clutches of the installment store. The settlement acts as an information and interpretation bureau. It constantly acts between the various institutions of the city and the people for whose benefit those institutions have been erected. The hospitals, the county agencies, the state asylums are but vague rumors to the people who need them most. The settlement also acts and resembles that of a big brother whose mere presence on the playground protects the little ones from bullies. Our first winter, 3 boys from a Hull House club became injured at one machine in a neighboring factory for lack of a guard that would have cost but a few dollars. When the injury of one of these boys resulted in his death, we felt quite sure that the owners of the factory would share our horror and remorse and do everything possible to make good and secure the safety of these machines. To our surprise, they did nothing whatever. And I made my first acquaintance with these pathetic documents signed by the parents of working children, that they would make no claims for damages resulting from carelessness. Our visits to the neighborhood constantly came across women working upon sweatshop work. Often they were accompanied by incredibly small children. I remember a little girl of 4 years old whose work it was to pull out basting threads hour after hour, seated at a stool at the feet of her bohemian mother, a little bunch of human misery. But for that, there is no social redress. For the only child labor laws at that time that had been garnered was from the coal miners' union, and it was confined to the children working in the mines. The labor statistics at that time in Chicago, there were none. And Mrs. Florence Kelly suggested to the Illinois Bureau of Labor, the Illinois State Bureau of Labor, that they investigate the sweating system in Chicago with its attendant child labor. As a result of this investigation, the committee recommended to the legislature the provisions which afterward became the first factory law in Illinois, 1893, regulating sanitary conditions in the factories and fixing 14 at the age of which a child might be employed. I want to read to you an incident that happened to me during our efforts to secure the first factory law in Illinois. I was invited by a friend of mine to go to the Union League Club to meet two of his friends. It was my recollections. I recall those early efforts of Illinois in which the Hull House joined to secure the passages of the first factory legislation. I was told by a representative while having luncheon at the Union League Club, a representative of an informal association of manufacturers, that the residents of Hull House should drop this nonsense about a sweatshop bill of which they knew nothing. If they did, certain businessmen would agree to give $50,000 within 2 years to be used for any of the philanthropic activities of the settlement. As the fact broke upon me that I was being offered a bribe, I felt shame. What had befallen the daughter of my father? My father had never been offered a bribe because bad men were instinctively afraid of him. I explained as quickly as I could that we had no ambition to make Hull House the largest institution on the West Side, but that we were much concerned that our neighbors should be protected from untoward conditions of work, and so much for the works, youth must commit itself, and that to accomplish this, if the destruction of Hull House was necessary, that we would cheerfully sing Te Deum on its ruins. The guest friend who had invited me to lunch at the Union League Club to meet two of his friends who wanted to take over the sweatshop bill, here kindly intervened, and we all hastened to cover the awkward situation by that scurrying away from the ugly morality which seems to be an obligation of social intercourse. Of course, there was always the harrowing consciousness of the essential difference between ourselves and our neighbors. Even if we had gone to live in the most wretched tenement, there would always have been an essential difference between them and ourselves. For we should have had a sense of security in regard to illness and old age. And the lack of these two securities are the specters which most persistently haunt the poor. One day, a little boy of 10 led a tottering old lady into our house, saying that she had slept for the past 6 weeks on a bed in their kitchen next to the stove. And although none of them had ever seen her before, but because when her son died, she knew that her son had once worked with Paul, that she had thought of him when she had nowhere to go. The little fellow concluded by saying that since our house was so much bigger than theirs, he thought we would have more room for beds. The old woman herself said absolutely nothing, but looking on with that gripping fear of the poorhouse in her eyes, which was so heartbreaking that the occupants of the county infirmary seemed scarcely less wretched than those who are making their last stand against it. The Working People's Social Club was founded in the spring of 1890 by an English working man, and they met once a week at Hull House for 7 years. Hull House did contract an early reputation for radicalism. Visitors visiting Hull House refused to distinguish the difference between the sentiments of the members of this club and the sentiments and the opinions held by the residents themselves. At that moment in Chicago, the radical of every shade of opinion was vigorous and dogmatic, of the sort that could not brook the slow march of human improvement, of the type who knew exactly in what corner of the world utopia standed. Of course, many people were indifferent to the idea of the sect. Others looked on with tolerant, sometimes cynical amusement, which we would often encounter in a good stories told at our expense. But all of this was unreal and distant from us, for we felt sure that if the critics could but touch the life of the people, they would understand. After living among the poor for so many years, one is so overwhelmed by the misery and small lives of so large a number of people. One wonders that the conscientious people can leave it alone. The indictment of Tolstoy still fits nearly every American city. Fits every American city. If you draw a circle around you of 100,000 or 1,000 or even a 10-mile circumference, and you look at the lives of the men and women living inside that circle, you will find half-starved children, old people, pregnant women, sick and weak persons working beyond their strength, who have neither food nor rest enough to support them, and who because of that die before their time. The process of social change is delicate, and one must have an understanding of life as it is, of the good as well as of the evil. We have within life the beginnings and possibilities of the raising up of the human race. Democracy is still our most precious possession. Well, welcome to Hull House. I understand from Mary that you are interested in volunteering, perhaps maybe someday becoming a resident. The only anodyne for depression, unhappiness, social maladjustment is the giving of oneself to others. So where shall we start our tour? Let's start at the Labor Museum. There's an excellent exhibit on textiles on loan from the Field Museum. I believe that Mary will be able to meet us there. Thank you and welcome, with all my heart, to Hull House. Come along now, let's go. Thank you so much. And now, in the tradition of woman law, performing women in history, you have an opportunity to ask me, Jane Addams, any question you like, and then the other person will come on. Questions to me, Jane Addams?
When did you receive the Pulitzer or the Nobel Peace Prize?
The Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. Yes, I shared it with another man, but I am the first woman to garner that. After having been wholly vilified, I was always among the 100 most important Americans. And then when World War I came along, I am an ardent pacifist. I think war is wholly a waste of money and brings unbridled suffering and horror to so many people. I came out vehemently against the war, and as we know, one of the myths of America, we're a military society, an ardent fighting nation, as it were, and my star plunged down into the nadir, and I was wholly vilified, and it shocked me, frankly. I was always used to being treasured and honored, and so to be vilified, it sent me into quite the depression, and I left the United States and began touring around Europe, setting up the International Women's Peace Organization. And then slowly after the war ended, my star began to rise again until they decided to give me the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. But that's the journey and complication of us humans, is it not? Yes?
Who was your biggest supporter when you started? Like your family?
Well, actually, no, not my family, my mother-in-law. My stepmother would not give me a penny because I didn't marry her son, George. He was furious at me. But nevertheless, no, what I did is I had inheritance. So I started. And then, thankfully, because my stepmother was a woman of great society and culture, she had taught me all the beautiful, ways of being among the wealthy people. And also I had money. So what I did is I slowly went to the wealthy of Chicago, Beatrix Palmer, and I went, and people gave money. Mary's father gave money for a whole building, and I was able to go, and I had the ability to ask for money. And they also saw what was happening to the city of Chicago, which was this massive influx of uneducated people. And they understood that democracy will not be sustained. And many of them also were immigrants themselves. And they understood that socializing, you must have an educated populace for a democracy to flourish and exist. And as a democracy is an experiment of sorts, it's beholden to those who have the means to freely give it, and to make the society a better and just one. And Mary has a house in Bar Harbor, Maine, and we also get a lot of money for our friends up there. Louise DeCoven Bowen, the wife of a banker, gave 75 acres in Waukegan for a summer camp for the children. And we just simply kept getting money and resources, and also a lot of women at this time, wealthy women, were suffering from depression and the feeling of worthlessness, as I had suffered, and coming to Hull House, volunteering, made them feel better. I mean, that's one of the great hopes of humanity, is that the way out is through giving. That is how you will become happy. We are all wrestling with how we're going to become happy in this world. Actually, if you get the magic key, it's giving of yourself to others. The great mystic masters of the world have always told us that. More blessed to give than to receive. Buddha, if you knew what I knew about giving, you would give before every meal. It's to give, give, give.
Well, money is nice, but you need the workers like yourself.
Money is nice, and also talent and resources are nice, and skill, and all of that was donated. It wasn't just money that was donated. It was also people who had the ability to teach art. We had a woman from Lake Forest come, Annette, and she would come and she taught art. We had a brilliant art class. We had theater classes that were used. We celebrated all sorts of festivals. We started up museums, the Labor Museum. We had soup kitchens that we fed people. Whatever came up, whatever ideas came up, then I would go and try to get money for it or resources from it, and it was successful.
Did you teach people English?
Absolutely. There were English classes in Shakespeare. We had concerts. We had lectures. We had sports. We had the first playground in Chicago in 1894. In 1899, with the lawyers in Chicago, we were seeing the juveniles, the young people being thrown, if they got into trouble, being thrown into prisons with hardened criminals, coming out much the worse for wear. We started up the first juvenile system in the world that expanded out to the world. I saw the colored people of our city and our country being wholly prejudiced against, and I was on the board of the NAACP in 1910 when it was founded, and we just kept going, working and fighting and struggling to make right, because you are always fighting with evil, greed, all the nascent and dark shadows of all of our, we're all human, all of our capacities, but humanity has free choice. And so our effort was to go towards the light, towards love, towards a Christian, a democratic ideal. Not necessarily just Christian, of course. A spiritual ideal.
Did you have some kind of like a nurse?
I'm sorry, a little louder.
Did you have like a nurse or were you close like diphtheria or typhoid?
Oh, horrible diseases all through, absolutely, yes. Rattled and roiling. Actually, only 1 out of 5 children survived till 5 years old in the poverty-restricted areas of Chicago. It's filthy. Rats, vermin running around. Yes, that is correct. That is correct.
Close to a major hospital there?
Yes, hospitals were founded, and then emergency rooms where the poor could go. And we had doctors volunteer their time. Physicians were residents among Chicago. The University of Chicago supported us, the universities, everybody understood. And this was a part in educating the educated, that this was absolutely imperative for for the health and wealth and the treasured vision for our country, which was the brotherhood of man, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the pursuit of happiness, giving of yourself to others. Yes.
One of the goals would be to have people go and, say, graduate from Hull House into regular society. But that would take a family structure. And you said that this was just for women and children?
No, absolutely not. Women, children, men, absolutely. There was a Hull House Men's Club, a Hull House Women's Club. The men and women absolutely came in and used the facilities equally, absolutely equally. Yes. It was for everyone, and it wasn't really a school that we set up. We set up classes. People came and went wherever their interests were. They would work, hopefully what they were working towards was to get a strong, vibrant middle class, which is what you want. And so hopefully they would educate themselves, and they would get work, and they would contribute to the society and to the vibrancy of a great city. So they would come and go in and out, absolutely, and people would come to us with their problems, and we would slowly but inexorably, institutions were set up and laws were put into place to help raise the whole water level of our society.
So after you left, who took over?
I never left. I did live with Mary on Astor Street at her family home oftentimes, but basically I lived at Hull House.
You were certainly dedicated. What did you do for your own, not entertainment, but for your own growth?
I went to theater and lectures and to museums and art shows and savored every moment of it. Went to teas and luncheons and dinners and dances and had a splendid time. And I loved the children so much.
Were you at the 1893 exposition?
Absolutely. Went to the 1893 Columbian exhibition. Marvelous. Absolutely marvelous. Yes, very exciting. Just need to get that vote for the women. All right. There are no further questions. Good questions, by the way. Thank you. I will symbolically walk around the table. Become the other person. Thank you so much. Fantastic questions. Better than I got from a huge audience. My name is Betsey Means. I'm Artistic Director of Woman Lore, Performing Women in History, and I go back to the original writings of women in history and create scripts directly from those writings and costume and perform it. These writings from Jane Addams were taken from the first 20 years of Hull House. And the language is very cultured and cultivated, so it's like, to make that code trickling off the tongue is a bit of a challenge. But what a magnificent woman Jane Addams was. She was deemed the mother of social work. And just an amazing, really a master of compassion. She was like the closest that I've ever, all my characters, all the women I've done, she's closest to Jesus, and she is right there on it. And she suffered from deep depression. Her mother died when she was 3, so that makes everyone vulnerable. If your mother has died before you're 11. And she had to work on how am I going to get out of this depression? And she worked and worked and gave and gave and gave until she eventually found her depression lifting after a long time, after she established Hull House, and became happy, was able to be happy. She had to really deal with her depression. How am I going to get out of this depression? It was debilitating. If anyone suffers from depression.
All those different languages of the people who were in the neighborhood?
Well, what she did was she did not speak their languages. Everyone was going to speak English. That was, we're in America here. We're going to be speaking English, So, and by the way, let's celebrate your culture. And let's celebrate yours. Let's not leave your culture behind, because what she did find was the second generation was scornful of their grandmother who wore the babushka. And she was like, yeah, come on, let's bring the grandmother in. Show us how you did the loom. And they would show the spinning. And then their grandchildren could have more respect. And they were given a space to do this. And they were celebrated. And so, she was working on, and then they'd have folk nights of different countries, their dances, their food, and we'll all share it and learn about their culture. How exciting, how interesting, how vibrant, how exciting. And we're all now Americans, we're all here. Yeah, she was very, very supportive of the cultures and of the language and here's English. You're gonna want to need to know English. That's important,
But she sounds very respectful.
Very respectful. She loved it. She had so much fun. I don't know if any of you ever found yourself all of a sudden plopped down in a place that's like, why am I so happy here? It's a mess here. We've got rats running everywhere and it's filthy and I'm having a blast. These children are coming in and people are, oh my gosh, look what's happening and I can help and I'm going to become the garbage inspector. We're going to fight against Johnny Powers, the alderman. I'm going to run against him as alderman. She did that once she lost. He'd give a turkey to the families. She was just, it was amazing. She was having a great time. She was having a really great time. And she was thrown, as she said, into the stormy intercourse of life. Kind of how exciting is that? That's great. She's alive. That's what we all want to be, really, right? We all want to be alive and feel important, needed and important, and to alleviate suffering. And that's what's going to make you feel good. It's going to get you out of, your own self.
We've gone to Hull House. So when
Just a visit.
I'm just a little. Oh yeah. I'm just a little.
So when you were speaking of all the extra buildings and the Textile Museum and all of that, has all of that disappeared? Because I don't remember seeing any of that. Just
Only the
the Hull
house
House itself.
Tragic.
Only the house.
University of Illinois.
To a lot got all their property.
Yeah, Hull House is still there.
Yeah, that's the only piece that's left.
Hull House is still there, and next door she had bought a saloon that had become the Hull House Diet Kitchen, where they serve simple but nourishing meals for people to come in and eat. But that is still there, and I think they made it into an auditorium. But her house proper, that was built in 1856, is still there, and it's a beautiful museum. They've done a fantastic job, and I highly recommend. It's right near Greektown. Actually, the Hull House was surrounded by about 3,000 Greeks. It was the largest Greek colony in Chicago at the time. But Greektown is right there. You go to Hull House, you go and have dinner, or lunch in Greektown, which is super fun. And they've done a beautiful, beautiful job. But tragically, it was fought by the neighbors. They fought it, but they lost. All of the rest of the 13 buildings were torn down and up, which I'm bummed about. But it happened in, 1860s, 1870s. Yeah. Yes.
What's interesting, you come to Whiting, because Whiting was an industrial town, and there was a lot of islands of different ethnic groups, and they talk about the hunky town, the Hungarians, or the Croatians, because they all had their own churches, their own schools, their own corners,
when they
saloons.
came. Yeah.
And but they kept that. I think the only thing they had in common is that they went to the same place to work. Either whether it was a steel mill or the refinery. But I think they were stratified in what kind of labor they could do there. The Greeks went in when it was terrible, or the Turks went in when it was super hot.
Interesting. Really interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
And that would have also been same thing with Chicago.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Were there other cities that mirrored what you did?
Yes, eventually in Chicago proper, about 37 houses got set up around the city. Hull has had a reputation for being full of intellectuals. That was really the brainstem. But a lot of other settlements did excellent, excellent work. And also in many, many cities, I think by 1900 there were like 200 settlements all around the country. So every city was getting into it. All of them just saw the needs. So people of goodwill started up settlements. Absolutely.
I worked at a settlement that was run by the Salvation Army on 30.
Oh, a little louder.
I worked at a settlement on 3053 Normal that was run by the Salvation Army.
There you go.
And we did, you know, before school care, after school care, daycare. We had a dental clinic. We had a senior thingy. We did, you know, like somebody would come to the city and be lost or confused. We would have tokens we would give them so they could go to the Salvation Army main intake. You
How
know,
cool is that?
whatever was kind of going on. At one time, they had when we had all the tuberculosis, they even had one of the buildings that they used for people that were recovering from tuberculosis.
Wow, that is just spectacular. Where was that?
It was at 3053 South Normal. 33 Normal.
In Chicago?
Mhm.
Wow. And what was
Yeah,
the
it run
name
by
of the settlement?
It was run by the Salvation Army. So
And you
that's what
worked
it was
there?
called. Yeah, for years.
And what was the experience like?
Well, they ended up closing and another social service agency bought it out. But it was interesting, the history was interesting.
The history.
You know, because everybody came there for everything. You know, I got paperwork and I don't know how to get it translated.
Absolutely.
Or I've got, you know, any crazy things that you wouldn't even think of, you know. People would come. Well, of course, the Salvation Army too tends to attract people that are looking, you know, for something.
Yeah.